The file in front of you was never officially closed. The investigators moved on. The witnesses stopped talking. The leads ran dry, but the case never closed. What you are about to hear has been documented. The timeline, the evidence, the questions that were never answered. Welcome to case number unknown. Let's open the file. In 1823, over 200 men, women, and children boarded ships in London. Bound for a tropical paradise they had been promised was waiting for them. A land of fertile soil, golden rivers, and a welcoming native population eager to trade. They had sold their homes. They had spent their life savings. They had purchased land deeds, government bonds, even currency from this promised nation. But when their ships finally reached the shores of Central America, they found nothing. No settlement, no government, no civilization, only mosquito-infested jungle and swampland that would become their graveyard. More than half of them would die within months, and the man who sent them there, a decorated war hero named Gregor MacGregor, was back in London, living lavishly off their money, preparing to do it all over again. This is the story of the most audacious fraud in modern history, the man who invented an entire country and sold it to the world. Gregor MacGregor was born in 1786 in Edinburgh, Scotland, into a family that claimed descent from the legendary Rob Roy MacGregor. From a young age, MacGregor was obsessed with status, titles, and the romance of military glory. At 16, he purchased a commission in the British Army and served in the Peninsular War against Napoleon. But his military career in Britain was unremarkable, and by 1811, he had sold his commission and set his sights on something far more dramatic: the independence wars raging across South America. MacGregor sailed to Venezuela, where he inserted himself into the revolutionary circle of Simón Bolívar. He fought in several engagements, and by most accounts, he demonstrated genuine bravery in battle. Bolívar awarded him the rank of general, and MacGregor basked in the prestige. But he was also erratic, prone to exaggeration, and increasingly difficult to work with. He led a disastrous attempt to seize the Spanish-held island of Amelia Island off the coast of Florida in 1817, briefly declaring himself its ruler before abandoning his men when the situation deteriorated. He then launched an equally catastrophic attack on the Spanish fort at Portobelo in present-day Panama. Each time a pattern emerged: grand promises, initial bravado, and then retreat, leaving others to suffer the consequences. But it was in 1820 that MacGregor conceived the scheme that would define his legacy. While on the Mosquito Coast of present-day Honduras, he encountered the local Mosquito King, George Frederick Augustus I. Through a combination of charm and possibly fabricated documents, MacGregor claimed he had been granted 8 million acres of land along the Black River. He called this territory Poyais, and in his mind, Poyais was not just a tract of jungle. It was a sovereign nation, and he was its prince, His Serene Highness Gregor I, Cazique of Poyais. MacGregor returned to London in the autumn of 1822, and what he did next was nothing short of extraordinary. He launched a full-scale marketing campaign for a country that did not exist. He opened a Poyais legation office in London, staffed with officials. He published a detailed guidebook, a 355-page volume attributed to a Captain Thomas Strangeways, which described Poyais in breathtaking terms. According to this book, Poyais had a thriving capital city called St. Joseph, complete with a cathedral, a bank, an opera house, government buildings, and wide paved boulevards. The soil was so rich, the book claimed, that crops practically grew themselves. The rivers ran with gold. The climate was pleasant, the natives were friendly, and the opportunities were limitless. None of it was true, not a single word. But MacGregor was a master salesman. He dressed the part of royalty, hosted lavish dinners, and moved through London's highest social circles with a confidence that disarmed skepticism. He offered land certificates at remarkably attractive prices, 3 shillings and 3 pence per acre. He issued Poyais government bonds on the London Stock Exchange, raising £200,000 from investors, an enormous sum equivalent to tens of millions today. He even printed his own currency, Poyais dollars, and convinced settlers to exchange their British pounds for this worthless paper money, assuring them they would need local currency when they arrived. And people believed him, not just the desperate and the poor, though many settlers came from working-class backgrounds hoping for a fresh start. Professionals believed him, doctors, lawyers, tradesmen, even bankers. The early 1820 were a time of extraordinary speculation fever in Britain. Latin American independence movements had opened up new markets, and investors were pouring money into South American bonds and ventures with little due diligence. MacGregor exploited this mania perfectly. Poyais seemed no more exotic or risky than a dozen other legitimate investment opportunities circulating at the time. In September 1822, the first ship, the Honduras packet, departed London carrying around 70 settlers. A second ship, the Kennersley Castle, followed in January 1823 with approximately 200 more. These people carried with them land deeds, Poyais currency, letters of introduction to government officials who did not exist, and dreams of a new life in a tropical paradise. What they found when they arrived at the Black River in early 1823 was a nightmare. There was no St. Joseph. There was no capital city. There was no cathedral, no bank, no opera house. There was nothing but dense, untamed jungle, mangrove swamps, and suffocating tropical heat. The settlers were stunned. Some initially refused to believe they had been deceived, convinced they had simply landed at the wrong location. They sent search parties inland, looking for the civilization described in the guidebook. They found nothing. Within weeks, tropical diseases began to ravage the group. Malaria and yellow fever spread through the makeshift camp like wildfire. Food supplies dwindled rapidly. The Poyais currency was, of course, worthless with the local mosquito people, who had no knowledge of any such nation. The settlers had no adequate shelter, no medicine, and no means of escape. Desperation turned to despair, and despair turned to death. By the time a passing British ship, the Mexican Eagle, discovered the survivors months later, the scene was devastating. Roughly two-thirds of the settlers had perished. The survivors were emaciated, diseased, and broken. They were evacuated to the British colony of Belize, where more would die from their illnesses. Of the nearly 270 people who had sailed for Poyais, fewer than 50 would ever return to Britain alive. Back in London, Gregor MacGregor was completely untroubled. When news of the disaster began trickling back in late 1823, he initially denied everything, then blamed the settlers themselves for their misfortune, claiming they had failed to follow proper instructions. Remarkably, when authorities began investigating, MacGregor simply left the country. He traveled to France and attempted the exact same scheme all over again. In Paris, he opened a new Poyais office, published French-language promotional materials, and began selling land and bonds to French investors. He recruited a new group of settlers, but this time, French authorities were quicker to act. Suspicious reports from London reached Paris, and before the scheme could fully mature, MacGregor was arrested along with several associates in December 1825. What followed was a trial that should have ended MacGregor's career permanently. But in one of history's most baffling courtroom outcomes, MacGregor was acquitted. His co-conspirators were convicted, but the jury apparently believed MacGregor's defense that he genuinely thought Poyais was a legitimate territory and that he had been misled by others. Some historians suspect MacGregor's charm and aristocratic bearing played a decisive role. Others believe the French court was simply reluctant to convict a man who presented himself as a foreign head of state. MacGregor returned to London, and incredibly, he resumed selling Poyais bonds. Through the late 1820 and into the 1830s, he continued to market his fictional nation, albeit on a smaller scale. He found new investors, issued new certificates, and kept the myth alive. No British authority ever prosecuted him. The settlers who had survived, the ones who had lost everything, who had watched friends and family die in the jungle, received no justice and no compensation. The question that haunts this case is not just how MacGregor did it, but how he got away with it for so long. He perpetrated the Poyais fraud in various forms for nearly 2 decades. He was never imprisoned for it. He was never forced to return a single penny to his victims. The regulatory frameworks that might have stopped him simply did not exist, and the social structures of the time rewarded confidence and punished doubt. In 1838, MacGregor left Britain for the final time. He moved to Venezuela, where his earlier service in the independence wars still earned him respect. The Venezuelan government granted him a pension and citizenship, recognizing him as a general of their revolution. Gregor MacGregor died in Caracas on December 4, 1845, at the age of 59. He was buried with full military honors in Caracas Cathedral, a hero's farewell for a man who had sent hundreds of innocent people to their deaths through nothing more than words, paper, and an extraordinary capacity for deception. The Poyais scheme is often called the greatest fraud in history, and it is difficult to argue otherwise. MacGregor did not merely forge a document or steal from a bank vault. He fabricated an entire nation, its geography, its government, its economy, its currency, its culture, and he sold that fabrication so convincingly that people staked their lives on it. In an era before background checks, before international communication networks, before regulatory oversight, one man's confidence was enough to create a reality that hundreds of people accepted without question. More than 200 people died because of Gregor MacGregor's lies. He never faced a single day in prison. He died a celebrated man in a foreign land, his crimes largely forgotten. So the question we leave you with tonight is this: if the greatest con artist in history could invent an entire country and walk free, what does that tell us about how much we really verify before we believe? The investigation is ongoing. If you have a case you think deserves a file, leave it in the comments. New files open every week. Subscribe, because the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how long it takes.